What's up developers, it's Dari here from Code with Dari, and welcome back to a new video where we're going to take it a step further and talk about routing in Laravel. When you're building applications in Laravel, or really in any web framework, in my opinion, everything begins with routing. Think about it. Whenever a user types a URL into the browser, like /about or /dashboard, your application needs to know what it needs to do with the request. Should it load the page? Should it fetch some data? Should it redirect the user? That's exactly what routes are for. In Laravel, routing is the entry point of your application. It's the very first layer that receives the request and decides where to send it. You can think of it as the traffic controller. Every request passes through the routing system before it reaches a controller, a view, or even an API response. That's why whenever I make tutorials or have to explain someone the use of Laravel, I always begin with routing, before you can display a blade view, before you can work with controllers, or before you can even build a full authentication system. You need a way to map a URL to some code. As we discussed earlier, the main routing directory in Laravel is in the root of our project because it's stored inside the routes directory. By default, Laravel ships with the console and web.php file. The other two are added because we chose a React scaffolding. The console is where you define custom console commands, but for this video, we're going to stick with the web.php file because that's where you'll spend most of your time while building a typical Laravel application. Now this is the place where you define all the routes that respond to browser requests, the ones the user hits when typing the URL into the address bar. These routes typically return views, use sessions. Now for now, let's get rid of the first route that we have, and we also don't need the other part yet, so let's comment it out. And let's start from the beginning so I can explain everything step by step. Whenever you want to define a new route or endpoint in Laravel, you have to start using something which is called a facade. And honestly, this is a term that you will be using and seeing quite a lot when you make Laravel applications. So let me explain it. Laravel is built around a service container, which is basically a big dependency injection system that holds all the objects that your app needs. So router, cache, database, mailing, and so on. If we didn't have a facade, you'd often have to manually resolve classes from the container like this. So variable router is equal to app parentheses router. Then we can use our router object to access the get method, where we can add two parameters. The first one is the endpoint and the second one is a callback function. And we can return hello world. This is how it typically would use like. But with the use of a facade, we can use a class that provides a static looking interface to something inside the service container. And the one that we will use right now, which replaces the code that we have right here, is called route. And route is a facade class. So what we need to do is import the Illuminate support facades routes by clicking on it. All right. Now behind the scenes, this will resolve the router service from the container. By default, you'll notice that PHP Storm already adds the double colon right here. This is called a scope resolution operator, which is a double colon. This way, we're telling Laravel that we want to call a static method, and the method we would like to access, in our case right now, is the get method. So right here, we're basically saying register a route that responds to the get HTTP request. Now next to get, we have a couple others, which you might be familiar with when you have programmed in any other programming language, since this is not Laravel specific. The second one is the post method, which handles post request, usually used for submitting forms. We've got put, which handles put request for updating the entire resource. We have patch, which handles patch requests for partially updating a resource. We have delete, which handles delete requests for removing a resource. And we have options, which handles option requests, so often used in course pre-flight checks. But for now, we're simply going to stick to the get method. Now inside the parentheses of the get method, we need to pass in two things. And with things, I mean parameters, where the first parameter is the URI. In this case, let's just stick to the / endpoint, which is basically the home page of our application. Now, the second parameter is where things get interesting. Here, we're going to pass in the word function, parentheses, space, followed with a set of curly braces. Now, wonder what this is called? Well, this is an anonymous function. This function is what we call a callback. And the idea is, when someone makes a GET request to the / endpoint, Laravel will call whatever we have defined inside the parentheses of our callback function. So, what now? Well, we need to tell our callback function what it needs to return for the / endpoint. And the simplest example is just to return a string. Well, it can return way more. Think about a view, string, an array, JSON, or even a full response object. But for now, let's return a string of my name is Dari. So if we navigate to the browser right now, refresh our / endpoint, you'll notice that the simple string of my name is Dari has been outputted. Well, let's return an array as well, just to show you that this works as well. So instead of returning my name is Dari, let's return a set of brackets with, let's say, 1, 2, and 3 inside of it. Once we refresh the output, you'll see a pretty print, which outputs an array of 0, 1, and 2. All right, pretty cool, right? It does its job. Now, I would also love to show you other HTTP verbs, but we do need to have an actual design. If we navigate back to PHP Storm and change our method name to post, navigate to the browser and refresh it, and let me zoom out, you'll notice that we're getting an error, since we can only use post to make form requests. So just note that they are available, but we will be using them throughout the course. Since this project uses a React scaffolding with Inertia.js, the way we return pages changes a little bit to the default way of Laravel. The default way of returning a view is usually returning, not an array, but the view method. What this does is basically looking inside the resources directory, then inside the views directory, and you'll have to add the file name. So maybe the first page is named, let's create one, index.blade.php. Then inside our view method, we need to pass in a string. Then inside our view method, we need to pass in the view name. And you don't write it fully, because Laravel will strip the blade.php file extension. So the only thing we need to pass in right here is called index, which will by default look inside resources, views, and tries to find a match of index, which you can't do right now. So right here, let's just write down Dari, navigate back to Google Chrome and refresh it, change our HTTP method to get, navigate back to Google Chrome and refresh it, and you'll notice that Dari has been printed out. Now, whenever it's in a subdirectory, it basically works in the same way. So let's create a subdirectory named home. Let's move our index.blade.php file inside our home subdirectory. And right in front of the index string that we have passed in, we have to use the dot notation, just as we have done with outputting our configuration variables. So let's say home.index. So let's navigate back to Google Chrome, refresh it, and you'll see that Dari has been printed out. Well, we're not going to use Blade, so this was just for demonstration purposes. Let's delete our home subdirectory because we won't be needing it right now. Instead of returning a view when working with React or Inertia, you will have to return the Inertia facade. So let's import it. All right. Then we need to make a static call to the render method. This is the method that you will have to use to actually output the response. Now we're not done right here, since we do need to pass in one required and one optional argument inside of it. So the first argument is the easiest one, since it's just the name of the frontend page component you want to load. So right now we're dealing with Inertia, so we don't need the view subdirectory. Since it's JavaScript, we need to open JS, where we have a pages subdirectory, where right here we need to create a TypeScript file. So let's create a new file named index.tsx. So let's open the web.php file again and let's pass in index right here as our component. The second argument is optional, is an array of data that you want to pass from Laravel into the React component as a property. For fun, let's pass in an array of data where we have a key of author, which is equal to the config directory that we have, and I want to output the app.author, which we created in one of the previous episodes. Now, we're not done because inside our index file right now, we need to create a component. And I've already mentioned the file extension, which is TSX, which stands for TypeScript, which is a superset of JavaScript. That means that it's basically JavaScript plus an extra layer of type safety and tooling. So let's define a new component right here. Let's say export default function named index, and let's return parentheses. Let's go inside the parentheses and hit enter. Let's create an empty div where we're simply going to add an h1 followed with a piece of text of index page. All right, let's navigate to the browser and let's refresh it. And right here, you will notice that we have run into an error because the fight manifest does not exist. This is happening because we haven't run npm. So let's navigate to the terminal for a moment. And inside our project, let's run npm run dev, which will spin up our local host and it will compile all the new files. So let's navigate back to the browser. Let's refresh it. And right here, you'll notice that index page has been printed out. All right, we also did pass in a property, right? We passed in, let me go back to PHP Storm, author right here. Let's make this work. So let's use object destructing inside our index method. So right here, where we have to add a set of curly braces, enter, space, followed with a variable that we would like to output, which is author. All right. Right below our h1, let's create a paragraph and let's output our author variable right here with curly braces, author. As you can see, it's giving us a small warning right here. But it will work when you output it in the browser. Let's quickly test it out. You'll see that code with Dari has been printed out. But right now, we're not using TypeScript. This is called JSX. So let's transform our code a little bit. When you're writing a React component in TypeScript, you want to be clear about what kind of props that component expects. So right above our index method, we have to say this component expects an object with a property called author, and the property must be a string. If you pass anything other than a string, TypeScript will warn you. If you forget to pass author, it will also complain. We can do this by writing down the keyword type, followed with a name. I personally prefer to name it equal to the function name, followed with the keyword props behind it, with capital of index props. And let's set it equal to a set of curly braces. So we have already passed in a property named author. So let's say author colon, and the value needs to be a string. Right now, it's still complaining because it's never used, because we have defined our index props, but it's never used. But give me a second. Then we have to use our index props inside our function. So right after the curly braces, let's add a colon and let's add our index props right here. If we navigate to the browser, refresh it, you'll notice that it still works. All cool, these routing stuff. But how does this work behind the scenes? If we navigate back to PHP Storm, open our bootstrap directory and then the app.php file, you'll see a piece of code which looks like this right here. This might look a little bit scary, and honestly, in most apps, you won't even make a big change right here. But let's go through this step by step. The first thing that you will see is called application : configure. This is Laravel bootstrapping itself. It's setting up the application instance. Then we have the base path right here, which will tell Laravel where the root of our project is, so it knows where to look for things like config files, routes, and resources. Then we have with routing. This is where Laravel registers which route files it should load when the application starts. And inside that method, right here, we see 3 parameters being passed in. The first is called web. This tells Laravel, when you boot up the application, load all the routes that are defined inside the web.php file. And this is why whenever you define a route inside the web.php file, as we have done right here, Laravel already knows about it because it's being registered right here. Next, we have the commands console.php. As we have mentioned before, this is where you can define custom artisan commands. And finally, we have health:up. And this is a special route that Laravel automatically sets up for you. It's basically a health check endpoint. If you visit the browser and change the endpoint to /up, Laravel will return a simple response to let you or your server know that the application is alive and running. This is pretty useful in production when you load balancers or monitoring tools that needs to quickly check if your application is healthy. Alright, this was it for now. I want to wrap up this video where I showed you the basics of Laravel routing. Please make sure that you are subscribed, turn on the bell and follow along because we're going to go deeper and deeper, but in a simple, beginner-friendly way. Thank you for watching. In the next video, we're going to have a look at how we could use route parameters.